So, how does comedy work? At first glance, comedy seems incredibly simple. Something happens, a person laughs, tiny dopamine fireworks, and scene. But the deeper you look at it, the stranger it becomes. Because laughter is a very weird response to reality. Crying makes sense. Fear makes sense. Anger makes sense. Those are straightforward survival tools. Something bad happens, your body reacts accordingly. But laughter is your nervous system briefly malfunctioning in a socially acceptable way. It's your brain encountering chaos and deciding to clap, which is odd behavior for a species that once evolved to survive predators. Imagine a caveman hearing a noise in the bushes and instead of running, he points at it and goes, "Ha! Nice." Natural selection should have shut this down immediately. And yet, comedy survived, thrived even. Entire careers exist because humans enjoy hearing carefully timed nonsense delivered with confidence, which means comedy clearly does something important. And unfortunately, that means we have to talk about the brain. Now, your brain is basically a prediction machine. That's most of what it does all day. It predicts sounds before they happen, predicts words before people finish speaking, predicts where objects will move, how conversations will go, whether replying K was passive aggressive or just emotionally exhausted. The brain hates uncertainty, so it constantly builds patterns to make reality feel stable. Comedy exploits this like a professional scam artist, which is really just a guided prediction. You hear, a man walks into a bar, and instantly, your brain starts constructing possibilities, language patterns, story structures, expected outcomes. Your mind quietly says, "Okay, I understand the rules here." And then the punchline arrives with a steel chair. Because comedy works through violation. Not random violation, controlled violation. That's the important part. If the punchline is too predictable, the brain gets bored. If it's completely random, the brain gets confused. But if it's almost logical, just twisted slightly sideways, the brain experiences a tiny collision between expectation and reality. That collision creates tension. And when the brain realizes there's no actual danger, release laughter. Comedy is basically psychological whiplash with good marketing, which is why timing matters so much. A joke told too early feels awkward, too late, and it dies in front of everyone like a Victorian child. There's a microscopic window where the audience's expectation fully forms, but hasn't resolved yet. That's where comedians strike, which is honestly terrifying when you think about it. Stand-up comedians are essentially emotional assassins who study breathing patterns and sentence rhythm for a living. And great comedians know something else. Silence matters. That weird pause before a punchline, that's not empty space. That's tension inflating. Your brain leans forward subconsciously. It anticipates completion. And then, the joke reroutes the train directly into a wall. Not a dangerous wall, a soft wall. A wall wearing novelty glasses. But still, now suddenly the brain has to rapidly update its understanding of reality. That update feels good, which sounds fake, but neurologically, it's kind of true. Studies suggest humor activates reward systems tied to problem solving and surprise. Your brain likes successfully resolving confusion. Comedy gives you tiny, harmless puzzles. That's why wordplay works. That's why absurdity works. That's why someone editing dramatic orchestra music over a raccoon stealing bread somehow becomes art. The brain enjoys patterns breaking safely, which also explains why horror and comedy feel weirdly similar, because structurally, they almost are. Both rely on tension, both manipulate expectation, both create uncertainty. The only difference is the landing. Horror says, something's wrong. Comedy says, something's wrong, but in a survivable way. A person slipping on ice is tragedy for half a second, then they stand up. Comedy restored. That tiny moment matters, because laughter depends on safety. You cannot laugh properly while genuinely threatened, which is why distance becomes so important. Time distance, social distance, emotional distance. A mildly embarrassing moment happening right now, painful. The exact same moment 3 years later with dramatic reenactment music, comedy goal. Humans are fascinating that way. We keep converting suffering into entertainment once enough time passes. History is basically humanity waiting long enough to make jokes about itself. And culturally, comedy evolves constantly. What people laugh at changes with technology, politics, stress levels, and collective brain damage. Ancient comedy involved exaggerated theater masks and public humiliation. Modern comedy involves editing Subway Surfers gameplay underneath existential despair. Same species, different tools. Internet humor especially feels like comedy after surviving several consecutive psychological wars. Memes don't even try to make sense anymore. A blurry image of a penguin with a caption, "The council has decided your fate," gets 10 million views. Why? Because the modern brain is oversaturated. Traditional setup punchline structure still works, but online humor evolved into compressed absurdity. Comedy became speedrunning. The internet trained people to process jokes at machine gun velocity. One image, one sound effect, one frame of a man falling through a ceiling, immediate understanding. And somehow your brain keeps up, mostly. But comedy isn't just individual, it's social. Laughter spreads faster than logic. You can watch an entire room start laughing before they even understand the joke fully. That's because humans unconsciously mirror emotional behavior. Laughter signals safety, connection, group acceptance. It's social synchronization, which means comedy isn't just entertainment, it's emotional crowd control. It helps humans process awkwardness, fear, grief, failure, and the unbearable weirdness of existing on a spinning rock with taxes. Because reality is honestly ridiculous. You wake up, consume caffeine to become functional, stare into glowing rectangles for income, then reward yourself by watching strangers rank breakfast cereals online. Comedy helps smooth over the absurdity. It turns confusion into rhythm. That's why some of the funniest people often understand pain extremely well. Not because suffering automatically creates humor, but because comedy reframes helplessness. It takes something heavy and rotates it slightly until it becomes manageable. A joke doesn't erase discomfort, it just gives the discomfort structure. And structure feels safer. Which brings us to the strangest part of all. Comedy only works because humans expect the world to make sense. That expectation is the entire engine. Without rules, there's no violation. Without prediction, there's no surprise. Without seriousness, nothing becomes funny. Humor depends on order existing first, then breaking it elegantly. So how does comedy work? Scientifically, it's expectation colliding with harmless surprise. Psychologically, it's tension resolving safely. Socially, it's emotional synchronization disguised as entertainment. But deeper than that, comedy is what happens when intelligence notices reality slipping slightly sideways, and instead of panicking, it laughs. Because maybe laughter is humanity's strangest survival mechanism, a tiny rebellion against confusion, a way of saying, yes, existence is absurd. Yes, none of us fully know what we're doing. But if the universe is going to be ridiculous, we might as well enjoy the timing.